No, it wasn't. Thanks for watching. Actually, this is really for those people who dive into my comments after watching, if at all, anything of the first 30 seconds of the video, and then dive into the comments and tell me everything that appears later in the video. So the short answer is no, it wasn't, and that's it's a myth, and I'm going to go into detail about why. But first, a bit of admin. So yes, the title is a little bit clickbait. I get that, but unless you're new to the internet, in case you are new to the internet, this is how YouTube works. You need a clickbait title and then you talk about the subject. But if you don't do that, if I called this video something like a calm and rational discussion about the combat effectiveness of the M4 Sherman tank, I get like 4 views, and that'd be it. And also, the title is kind of a bit of a poke at the kind of people who hear myths like this. They hear it in a movie, or they hear it in a game, or they hear it in a forum or something, and without any research, they just go, seems legit, and then start repeating that rumour, and they just pervade and make it so that these rumours just keep on going around. It's not true. Don't say it, because you sound like a muppet to people who actually know. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on the Sherman platform, but I do know how to research. So feel free to drag me in the comments for everything that I missed or I didn't say about your favourite vehicle, or anything that you think I might have gotten wrong. To be fair, the algorithm loves it, even if it's negative stuff. It's water off a duck's back to me, so dive in and say what you want to say. So with that in mind, I'm going to dive into it and answer the question up front, which, as I said, is no. But with a little bit more detail, and because otherwise people seem to go into the comments and Hulk smash the keyboard because they don't like it if I answer the question too far into the video. And then after that, I'm going to get into a little bit more of a mid-level kind of dive into the Sherman as a platform. I'm not going to get into massive detail about the engineering of it, but I'm going to get into a few bits that are more broad than the original question of this video. And I'm going to answer some of the other myths and try and dig out some of those ones that are quite common repeated, and why some of that stuff is quite often repeated. So let's get into it. Now, this is a Tommy cooker. It's a World War I alcohol-fueled stove as used by the British Tommies, hence the name. It was a bit rubbish to actually cook with. It wasn't very good at boiling water, which was pretty much its main purpose in life, but it ignited reliably and stayed lit even in a breeze, and it didn't give off smoke, which is handy when you're trying not to get shelled by Germans. What it's not is a tank. The name Tommy cooker, or Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, was allegedly used as a nickname for the Sherman by the Germans due to its habit of exploding into a fireball on the first hit and killing its crew. Or at least that's the modern day claim, but it's not that simple. Where the name came from is a bit more complicated than that, and in part it's kind of friendly fire, so let's dig into that aspect of it first. MP Richard Stokes spoke at length about the failings of the modern of that era tanks, including stating that the Sherman was famously known by the Germans as the Tommy cooker, as reported by all the major newspapers. The trouble is, Stokes had a bit of a hard-on for behemoth tanks, and was, well, a bit of a knob. He spent the entire war ranting and spewing about the state of Allied armour and how bad it was. Unfortunately, a lot of what he said was absolute rubbish, but he said it a lot, and he said it loudly, and inevitably some of it stuck. And a lot of the ranting you hear today about the failings of British armour of the period and how it was all junk is directly connected to Richard Stokes' nonsense. So why did Stokes do this? Well, whether it's because he was a die-hard believer that bigger is better, or if it was related to him having mates that would happen to benefit from getting contracts to design and build these huge tanks, is hard to tell. But in order to try and make these super heavies a reality, he needed to convince the public and the powers that be that the current tanks were simply garbage, a task he set himself to with almost religious levels of enthusiasm. Basically, any time you hear everyone knows Churchill tanks were blah blah blah, view it with a whole lot of suspicion. There was a record of him saying in the debate about the Tommy cooker being reported in all of the major newspapers, and yet finding any quotes in official sources or newspaper quotes is like finding honesty in politics. Theoretically, it might be out there, but good luck tracking it down. As for the troops, there are records of interrogations of prisoners of war and so on, Germans, and in those interrogations there is discussion about how they would refer to it as a Tommy cooker. So it's not that the Germans didn't use the term, but there's no record of it ever being used in official documents particularly, and there's no record that it was specifically about the Sherman tank. Quite often the Germans would refer to the Tommy cooker as any Allied armour or any British armour. And on top of that, there's also some reference to the fact that They would refer to it as a Tommy cooker because this British armour was sitting out in the desert and sitting out in the sun, and it was cooking the Tommies inside because the metal was getting hot and so on. So it's not 100% clear what they meant and if they were specifically referring to the Sherman at all, as opposed to M3s or the Churchills or any of the other armour and tanks that were around at the time. As for post-war interviews and memoirs from soldiers from both sides, it's easy to say, well, they were there, they'd know. But it's not actually that simple. They were also there for many of the post-war years and exposed to the post-war media and opinions. The Sherman is a Tommy cooker story really gained speed post-war. Films like Patton labour the point about the Sherman being paper thin and easy to ignite due to its petrol fuel tanks, unlike the Germans and their reliable diesel-engined beasts. Now hold on, don't dive into the comments and start telling me how I've said something stupid. This is not my opinion, this is what the movies were saying. The Shermans, the Americans had petrol versions, and they used petrol versions because it matched their fuel supply, but all the British and the Russian versions were using diesel engines because that matched their more readily available fuels. And the Germans, on the other hand, their tanks were petrol because Germany didn't have good access to crude oil, so it used a lot of synthetically made fuels. That's like fuels that are made from things like coal and then processed into fuels. And the easiest thing to process out of coal is petrol rather than diesel. So German tanks, generally speaking, were operating on petrol. And if you look at the later Tigers, they were the ones that were leaking fuel and had those kinds of issues. The point is, post-war, everyone was subject to a barrage of "the Sherman sucks", and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, contrary to the story, crew survivability was pretty good for the Sherman, especially in late war models. If you get hit, and 4 out of 5 of you make it out, that's 4 people telling stories about how they only just survived being hit by a Sherman. By contrast, in a T-34, if you were lucky, 1 or 2 of you got out, so survival stories to balance out the propaganda stories were thinner on the ground. And the second reason is that in many ways the Sherman was a superior tank, but that doesn't make for a good story about plucky Allied soldiers going up against the odds in their substandard tanks against ferocious and indestructible Tiger tanks and prevailing. It's just Hollywood doing its Hollywood thing, but media shapes people's perception, and when the media lies, the lie becomes the commonly held truth. Old veterans are just as fallible as the rest of us, and a guy recalling the events of 30 or 40 years ago is going to have that recall influenced by these false narratives. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a common story by veterans that the Sherman was also called the Ronson, and it was because the Ronson had this branding, this logo that they used, which was lights first time, every time. And so they said that they used to call the Tommy cooker, the Sherman, the Ronson, because it would light first time on the first hit every time. And there's a bit of a problem with that. The slogan wasn't used until the 1950s, way after the war, so it couldn't have been true. Veterans were just remembering it and filling in the blanks with post-war media influence. There is one likely reason for the Shermans being called Ronson, and that's the flamethrower armed versions used in the Pacific Theatre. They were developed by the British as part of Hobart's Funnies, and the flame units were made by Ronson, so they were known as Ronsons, but also known as Zippos and also known as Wasps. And it was because they were horrifically good at their job, setting fire to stuff. And as a side note for my research geeks, if you're into doing research and stuff online, this is why it's really important to double check anything AI tries to tell you. I mean, not saying you should use AI as your go-to research. It's a useful tool in some ways, but this is why you shouldn't trust it, because a lot of these myths about the Sherman are very frequently repeated. And the Ronson's quite a good example of how it goes wrong, because you put in anything about Tommy Cooker or Ronson or whatever else, and AI will consistently tell you how, oh, the Sherman was called the Ronson because of the slogan, it lights first time every time, and it'll repeat this thing that is patently not true, because like I said, the slogan didn't exist until 1950. But if you specifically ask AI, was the Sherman called the Ronson because of the slogan, it'll say, oh no, the slogan was entered in 1950, so it's a myth that the Tommy Cooker was even called the Tommy Cooker, and it'll give you this whole spiel that completely contradicts the exact thing it said. So this is one of the downfalls of AI. When you do research and stuff like that, sure, use it to help point you in a direction, but oh my god, do you have to check afterwards. Anyway, back to the Sherman. So to sum up, the Sherman wasn't known as the Tommy Cooker widely by the British or the Germans during the war. There are references that it could have been used a little bit in slang, but there's definitely no particular official documents, and it's not showing up in newspaper articles of the period. It seems likely the Germans were using it to refer to all British armour anyway, so not just Shermans. Post-war, it's largely down to the media and the efforts of Richard Stokes saying things like, it's been in all the newspapers that the German name for the admirable Sherman is the Tommy Cooker, and that made the myth so prevalent. So, in the end, did the Sherman deserve the title? Well, at first, a little bit, yes. So, a speed run of how the M4 came to be. It was in the late 30s, the US had a big gun and no tank to put it in. So they did exactly what you'd expect. They took a big gun and rammed it into a small tank chassis, and it looked daft. And it was known as the M3. It was the Lee for the American ones and the Grant for the British ones. There was a few design differences between the two, so that's why the two designations. In fairness, it did what it was intended to do. It provided an armour platform for the newer, larger gun as a stopgap while the US got on with making the Shermans ready. And in the early part of the war, it was a decent enough tank, but it was only meant as a bridge between the woefully outdated M2 and the planned M4. It's crazy that America got to 1939 with only 400 M2 tanks in its entire inventory, especially when you consider what they had at the end of the war. The British actually kept their M3s in action right up to the end of the war, mostly against the Japanese. A note to my American viewers, the British did actually contribute quite significantly in the Pacific theatre. It wasn't just all Iwo Jima and Midway Island and stuff. But anyway, that's a story for another video. But yes, the British used these tanks out in the Far East. Meanwhile, back in the deserts in October 1942 though, the British were the first to field the shiny new M4A1s and M4A2 Shermans. And there was a problem. In many ways, which I'll get into in a bit, it was an exceptional improvement over previous armour, but like most new bits of kit, it had one or two bugs that only became apparent when it was tested in combat. Some genius thought that the best place to store ammo was in the sponsons. These are the bits of the tank that stick out over the tracks. Imagine if you're inside the tank and it's like a cross section of the tank, it's a sort of T-shape. There's the bit in between the tracks and it's the hole where the crew kind of sits in and so on, and then above the tracks, the hole expands outwards over the tracks. That area there is called the sponsons. Now, sure, in theory, it's a great place to put ammo if you want easy access for the loader to stuff rounds in the chamber at a high rate of knots. The downside is that in combat, the sponsons is where the majority of incoming rounds hit. So if the round penetrated, it found itself surrounded by a bunch of highly combustible propellant and warheads. Hits like this were almost always resulting in catastrophic failures of the Sherman and at a 70% rate of crew loss. So yes, these initial Shermans would appear to be deserving of the name, but in the grand scheme of things, this was a brief period. These early models were modified to put the ammo in wet storage under the floor of the tanks. Well, technically, they put the ammo under the floor of the tanks, but they only put wet storage into new builds. That wasn't something that was retrofitted into the older models. But the fact is, they moved the ammo. And wet storage doesn't mean the round is kept in water. It's like they have boxes with tubes in and the rounds are kept in the tubes, and in the box surrounding these tubes is this kind of, I think it's glycerol mixed with water, but it's a fire retardant substance. And the idea is that if the box gets damaged or penetrated, then the glycerol leaks into the shell so that if fire or some source of ignition gets in, it's immediately hit by fire suppressant, which buys the crew a little bit of time to get out of the tank. But with all these modifications, crew casualty rates dropped from 70% to around 10%, one of the highest survival rates for any tank fielded by any army in the war. So after the initial glitches were worked out, how did it fare? Well, in terms of combat, especially in the deserts of North Africa, it proved to be pretty exceptional. As compared to Panzer IVs, especially before they were upgunned to the higher caliber weapons, it hit harder, had better armour, and not just in strength, but the higher quality steel had a much lower spalling rate. Spalling is when a round hits the outside of the armour but doesn't penetrate, and it causes shards of steel to break away from the interior wall of the armour. Spalling is as lethal to tank crews as penetrating hits. It's basically like having a grenade go off inside the tank. The crew survivability was way higher than a Panzer IV, and there was a lot more of them. This is why the post-war movies represent the Sherman so badly. It's hard to be the plucky underdog when you have shed loads of superior tanks. Even against tougher targets like the Tiger and Panzer tanks, this superiority of numbers made a big difference. So the idea that the Sherman was a Tommy cooker that took one hit to brew up and off the crew is just nonsense. It was a tough little tank, it was highly versatile, and it had a great survival rate for the crews, especially compared to its contemporaries, which is kind of important to consider. So it was a good tank, but there's more myths out there, so let's dig into some of those. So the first one is that they were poorly built and unreliable, and you can thank that wank puffing Stokes for this one. They are absolutely not, in large part due to the American mastery of industrial scale. Unlike the European countries, America didn't have to deal with the same shortages of materials and constant threat of being visited by Axis bombers. But more than that, they nailed mass production and quality control. As with the production of P-51s and other military vehicles, Shermans were mass-produced to specific criteria and specifications. There was nothing handcrafted or bespoke about them. Every Sherman off the line was near identical, and this meant that parts and maintenance were much more streamlined too. On top of that, it was designed as a tank to be worked on where it lived. In a workshop, changing the engine in a Sherman took a day or so. A Panzer IV engine could take up to a week. And mass production meant America built 50,000 Shermans deployed to Europe, Africa, Asia and Russia. Germany, on the other hand, built a total of 50,000 of all armour types, including tracked field guns, specifically around 25,000 Panzer IIIs and IV models, 6,000 Panthers and about 2,000 Tigers and King Tigers. When you take into account all the other Allied armour assets like the M3s, Churchills, Cromwells, T-34s, to name a few, Germany was vastly outnumbered on the tank front. Which brings us to myth number 2, it had poor armour and a weak-ass gun. And this one actually grinds my gears a bit. No, it didn't. It had the gun it needed for the task it was designed to do. It just blows my mind that people play games like War Thunder and they go, well, this tank has got an amazing tank killing gun, therefore it's better. That's not what the job of the Sherman was. Again, thanks to movies, the Sherman is often portrayed as permanently in tank duels with the mighty German tanks, and this simply wasn't its job for the majority of the time. Sure, there were tank-on-tank conflicts, but in Europe, this was mostly in the first months of the liberation of France, and the Shermans did have the Firefly to help with that. At a casual glance, you could buy into the myth that the reason there were far more 75mm armed regular Shermans was because of a lack of resources to make more Fireflies. But this is nonsense. While the Firefly was really good at its one job of putting a hole in the front of a Tiger tank, it wasn't a great all-rounder, and it had quite a few other flaws, but we're not going to get into that right now. And that was the crux of it. The Sherman, by far, was more often deployed in infantry support roles and going up against soft targets or bunkers. And in this role, it didn't need high velocity, it needed high explosive. The 75mm rounds were thinner and shorter, but they contained more high explosive because the walls of the shells were thinner. So the actual round had more bang. And in tests of the lethal shrapnel patterns of 75mm and 76mm rounds, they found the 75mm rounds were actually producing almost twice as many fragments as the 76mm. Not so great against a tank, but ideal to post through the window of a house containing Germans with machine guns, or into artillery positions, and so on. Overall, the Sherman was a popular tank, and by the end of the war, nothing like the myth that Tommy Cooker would suggest. Of all World War II tanks, the one you were most likely to survive getting hit in was a Sherman. There is a suggestion that part of the reason for the myth was that in combat it would be normal to wail on a tank until you saw it catch fire to make sure it was out of action and not salvageable. This would mean that after a battle, most of the Shermans would be burnt out, leading to the impression of many brewed-up Shermans. But then, surely this would be true of the German tanks too. In practice, many German tanks were burned by their crews when they abandoned them, even if they weren't destroyed by enemy fire. They would sometimes set fire to them simply because they got stuck or they just ran out of fuel. I didn't really get into things like the Firefly and Hobart's Funnies, and we didn't talk about the Sherman's activities in Korea. But hopefully there was something in here that was new to you and something you found interesting. But for the love of big iron war horses, please stop calling the Sherman tank a Tommy Cooker. To those that know, they know that you sound like a muppet when you do that. Thanks for watching.